Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series to help you create a fulfilling second half of life. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement, and your facilitator and host today. And I'm really delighted that we have Ashton Applewhite with us for today. I want to introduce Ashton Applewhite, who is an author and activist, and she's been recognized by the New York Times, National Public Radio, American Society on Aging as an expert on ageism. She blogs at This Chair Rocks. She speaks widely, has written for Harper's and Playboy, and is the voice of Yo, Is This Ageist? And she did a TED Talk, a main stage TED Talk, and it's going to be available on August 9th. So I want to just let everybody know that, and I know I'm really looking forward to being able to hear that. And I do want to mention about her book. It's really phenomenal. And as when she and I were talking, you know, you would think sometimes a book about ageism would be dry and depressing. Ashton writes in such a wonderful way, and I mean, her career as a writer, and it's a wonderful book, and you will be surprised. I mean, she just sort of shoots from the hip, says things as she sees them, gives examples of her own, and also it's such a rich resource of just mentioning a lot of other books so that it's really evidence-based in addition to just being a great read. So I really recommend that everybody read her book. It's called This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. So, Ashton, welcome. I'm delighted that you're here. And, you know, maybe we can start with you just talking about what got you interested in aging and in particular about ageism.
It's great to be here. Thank you. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would be fascinated with aging, I would have thought you were nuts. And why would I want to spend so much time thinking about something that would be gloomy and depressing? And I think that's, you know, how a lot of us think about aging. One of the many things I didn't realize was, of course, aging is not just something inconvenient that your parents do or baby boomers do, right, you know, north of middle age. It is how we pass through life. We are aging from the minute we're born, right? So it's the best subject in the world for a generalist like me. I'm not an academic. If I had been one, I think I would have been a sociologist. You know, how does society affect people and how do people shape society? And hindsight being 2020, I never figure anything out until way later down the path. I started writing about aging because I was afraid of getting old, although I didn't realize it at the time. And I got my foot in the water because of a chance comment that my mother-in-law made. At the time, she was in her mid-80s, and she and her husband Bill were booksellers. And she said, why don't you write about something people ask us all the time? So when are you going to retire? So that was like, it was contained, it was upbeat. We all liked the idea of being able to continue to work and have our lives, you know, be productive, air quotes around productive. And I started interviewing older people who work, people over 80, and learning about longevity. And those older people were a dime a dozen.
Are you there?
Hello?
I think we just lost you for a moment.
Oh, sorry. Nothing changed. Okay now?
You ended up, the last thing we heard was older people are a dime a dozen.
Yeah, it was great, easy to find fascinating older people to interview, and that didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was all the things I learned in 5 minutes about longevity that totally shook up my preconceived ideas. For example, I mean, what I learned was much more positive and much more nuanced. I thought the odds of ending up in a nursing home were pretty darn good. I would have thought, 20 or 30%. And the percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes is 4%, and it's falling. I thought the odds of getting dementia, every time I couldn't remember something, I thought, that's the first sign. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. If you subtract that 4% of people in nursing homes, many of whom do have severe cognitive impairment, 90% of the rest of us can think just fine to the end. We may take more time to remember someone's name, or where we put the keys. But the point is, we can continue to function just fine in the world to the end. Same with physical mobility. Some physical decline is inevitable. Something's going to give out, but not everything. And not all at once, and we learn to adapt. We already, at 40, you can't do the things you did at 30, and you can't do the things you did at 20. So you think we're terrified of falling off this cliff and waking up old one day where everything's awful, and it doesn't happen like that. There is no dividing line. So to answer your question, I started learning more about longevity, and the spark for the book was, why don't more people know these things? Because they're readily available. Another one being, if you Google U-curve of happiness, people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. Backed up by dozens of solid scientific studies. Why don't people know these things? And we don't know it because we live in a society that drowns out all but the negatives about late life. Because if aging is framed as a disease, we can be persuaded to buy stuff to cure it, air quotes around cure. And if aging is a problem, we can be persuaded to buy stuff to stop it or fix it. And aging isn't a problem, and it's not a disease. It is a natural, powerful, lifelong process that we are all embarked on.
It's so important to hear you say that. And, it's amazing. we live in such a youth-oriented culture, and there's this fear of aging that I think starts early on. Maybe if you could speak to that a little bit, too. I know.
Well, fear, I sometimes just say fear makes us stupid. When you are really afraid, if you're in the proverbial foxhole, you are worried about staying alive, maybe looking after your kids, But a lot of prejudice operates by pitting groups against each other, right? The example from Karl Marx is, if the Irish factory workers are competing with the Polish factory workers, they're not going to organize and say to the owners of the factory, hello, we deserve better working conditions and higher wages, right? In the case, another example is stay-at-home moms arguing with moms who work outside the house about who's a better mom. When if we organize together to get a better living wage and get subsidized caregiving and it closed the wage gap, there would be enough for everybody, right? So the fear that someone else is going to, get something you don't have, or that you're going to be in the grips of a process that is entirely negative, it's always based in ignorance. And if you're just struggling to stay ahead or to feed your family, you may not have the luxury of coming up out of that metaphorical foxhole and looking around. But that's sort of what I did. I started looking around at the landscape and going, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's not that there are not legitimate things to worry about. We are all worried about maybe getting sick, maybe running out of money, maybe ending up alone. And those fears are legitimate and real. But what never occurs to most of us is that those fears can be better or worse depending on the culture in which we grow old or even just reach middle age. So I want people to just, look around and learn a little bit more about the landscape so that we can see how disproportionate our fears are and how to prepare better for the inevitable challenges. When we're less afraid, we learn more, we are more inventive, and just the fear itself. There's a tremendous amount of research, you could ask me about it later if you want, but about how attitudes towards aging affect our health, our physical and mental health, both at the cellular level. So this anxiety about aging, most of which is if not entirely baseless, way out of proportion, is bad for our brains and bad for our bodies. And it's certainly bad for our social lives, because if you think no one's going to want to hang out with me, or I don't want to hang out with those old people, or I look ugly because I have wrinkles, et cetera, then your world gets small, and that's not great for us either.
Right. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what is ageism? How do you define it? And what have you been learning about ageism? Because I know it's both societal as well as internal. I mean, we internalized a lot of part of it. So
that's true. I mean, ageism, the formal dictionary definition is stereotyping and discrimination on the basis of age. I think of it as we're ageist anytime we think differently about a person or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are. And it's important to remember that ageism can cut both ways. Every time you say, millennials are entitled, or assume that a young person is too young to take on a job or responsibility, instead of finding out what they're capable of, that's being ageist, just as it is maddening for someone in their 50s, perhaps, who has been laid off, who has all this wealth of experience, who cannot even get an interview because someone just looks at their age on their resume or figures it out and decides, oh, they're too old, in quotes. You might be too ignorant. You might be too lazy. You might be too smart. But you're not too old or too young for a responsibility. And the assumption that or to jump out of an airplane or to sit on a porch swing, it's not age that determines whether or not we are capable of and qualified to do something. It's a whole range of social, biological, and cultural conditions that determine that. There's no such thing as act your age. I mean, another thing about the stereotyping piece is that, the idea of stereotyping is, of course, that all members of a group are the same. And they're never true, even when they're positive. All old people are wise? I don't think so. I've met some older people who don't seem to have learned much along the way, and we've all met those wise children, right, when you get a shiver and you're like, oh, right, this kid knows stuff, right? So stereotypes are always a mistake, of course, but they are especially dumb when it comes to aging, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. If you have a group of 7-year-olds, obviously each one is unique, but they have a lot more in common because they haven't lived long enough to be shaped by life than a group of 27-year-olds who have more in common than a group of 57-year-olds. And the older someone is, the less their age tells us about what they're capable of, interested in, anything. It just tells you less and less about them.
Mm-hmm. And yet we still are so driven by that, about, kind of how old. Yeah.
We like to pigeonhole. I mean, one of the thought experiments in the book would be, imagine if we didn't put the age of people in newspaper stories, unless, of course, it's an obituary or it's a prodigy. There are cases where age is relevant, but often it just seems relevant because we're so used to it. And if we had to think for a little bit, wonder, how old that person is who did that thing or saved that cat from the tree or wrote that book or whatever it is, that questioning is good. And it is the same reason journalists hate this idea. I've floated on them and they're like, no. It's part of the who, what, when, where, why. It's only part of the who, what, when, where, why because of habit. We used to put race in newspaper stories, and we don't do it anymore for exactly this reason, because we all pigeonhole. Everyone is prejudiced. Everyone is ageist. I think ageist stuff all the time. We all do it. It's human. But if we don't have that sort of mental shortcut, and have to think a little bit about, gee, I wonder if that person was young or old, fat or thin, white or black, country, whatever, it makes us think about that person as an individual and judge the story on its own merits. And ideally, that's what we would do in any encounter, not judge someone by what they look like, but talk to them a little bit or read about them and find out what they're actually capable of.
Wouldn't that be nice? More of that happened. It really would be. So maybe expand on some of the stereotypes and the sort of myths of old age that get going, because I think it's important to hear that and think about that. Yeah.
I think, the biggest stereotype of all is the one I just mentioned, which is the idea that older people are alike. Right. Because obviously, just like not all, Latinos are alike or veterinarians are alike, how could anything be true of all the baby boomers, for example? I think another myth is that older people are incompetent. There's so much information in the book chapter about the brain, so much positive stuff about the brain that we don't know about. We used to think until quite recently that, you had all this neurological growth when you were growing up into your teens, and then it was all over and stuff just started to, die back. We now know that what we call neuroplasticity. The brain is plastic. It changes throughout life. Older people can learn stuff all the way along. We think that one reason older people can take longer to come to an answer is that they are literally, think of it like a vocabulary, like a data bank. There's more data to sift through, and there's evidence that shows that older people may come to a better decision because they're weighing more data or weighing more information from their own lives. And also we have experience. So perhaps we learn, I heard a nice story about someone who was working in a mixed age group, because there's a lot in the workplace. There's a ton of prejudice that older people are stuck in their ways, can't learn new things, aren't comfortable on computers, blah, blah, blah. Well, that is true of some older people, but it's true of some younger people too, right? It's not age dependent. And she talked about being in a meeting with older people and younger people, and and the younger people were throwing out some kind of wild ideas that the older people knew were wild ideas, but they were able to say why some of them weren't, in their experience weren't so solid, but they were also inspired by some of the new ideas that the younger people thought of that they wouldn't have thought of. So tons of evidence that shows that mixed age teams, especially when it comes to something creative, are the most effective. Another workplace stereotype is that older people get sick more. Not true. Or cost more. Well, there's once you're 65, there's Medicare. So healthcare costs for employers go down. It is true that if an older person hurts herself, she takes longer to heal than a younger person, but older workers hurt themselves less often. So just as in the creative team, you could say, except it would be a stereotype, it would be untrue. Well, younger people come up with more ideas, but older people have sounder ideas. Neither of those is true. But the point is that the mix is really fertile, right? I mean, and when you think about this, it's intuitively obvious. It's why there's less ageism in rural communities, where people of all ages live together, and where the ways in which people contribute all life long are obvious and not so tethered as they are in our Western capitalist society to whether you have a job and whether you make a lot of money. Those values are not friendly to young people, and they're not friendly to older people.
Yeah, they're being productive, and that's the equation of what makes you successful, which I think must tie into. Oh no, go ahead. Yeah. Well,
early on, this was a project about older people who work, right? I mean, I got very sucked into that idea. It's all going to be okay, air quotes, if you just keep working, if you stay in your home and you hang on to your job, and et cetera. And two thoughts on that, one from two people who have inspired me. One was Robert Butler, who has since died, but he coined the term ageism in the 60s because he was inspired by the women's movement and the civil rights movement, by racism and sexism and the movements against those. And he said, we need a movement against ageism. And I interviewed him for my book project. The book never got written. I wrote this book instead. And he said, and I was talking about productivity, and he said very gently, if someone is just getting themselves out of bed and maybe getting themselves dressed, they're being productive. And it really, and even if they're, if they're, watching kids and helping someone else go out to a job, that's being productive. And I realized my notion of productivity was way too narrow. And the other person who's influenced me a lot is a geriatrician named Bill Thomas. And he has a book called Second Wind, in which he talks about the tyranny of still. The idea that as long as we are still driving or still running up the stairs, still dating younger women, we all have our stills, right? We're all human, and we all have these things that we really, really hope we're going to be able to do to the end. And as long as we can do them, everything will be okay. And the fact is, of course, that everything changes. Nothing stays the same. And it's nutty and punishing to hold on to this idea that aging well, again in quotes, means struggling to look and act like younger versions of ourselves, because at some point we can't do it. We can do bits of it, but not all of it. So let's abandon that standard, which is punishing, which is impossible, which disadvantages women and people without money disproportionately, right? And embrace the idea that we keep changing and adapting throughout life. We celebrate that when we're young. Why should we stop celebrating it when we're north of middle age?
And in fact, that's one of the things, I mean, you both mentioned in your book, and studies also talk about the resilience, really, that older people have, and sometimes people kind of forget that.
We get better, especially just north of 80, which is where that U-shaped curve really stands up. We get better at managing negative emotions like anger and envy and fear. And I can't tell you how skeptical I was when I first when I heard about the U-curve of happiness. I thought, well, one scientist must have cornered two 80-year-olds and given them a cookie and said, "How are you doing?" I mean, I really, and then I thought, well, it must be true if you're healthy and if you're wealthy. But the study obtains across class, across cultures, across marital status. It is a function of the way aging itself affects the brain, which is so amazing, right? And of course, it's not true of everybody. I mean, my mother-in-law used to say, 80 is different from 60 and not in a good way. But she was a complete denialist. She never acknowledged getting older. She never acknowledged getting ill. And I have to say, she did it her way right to the end. She died this January at home, in bed, after 72 years of marriage with her husband next to her. He died 8 days later. You know, she had it her way. That's not how I want to do it, but we each have to do it in our own way and in our own time. There's no right way to age. There's no such thing as acting your age. There's no such thing as age appropriate. What works for you may not work for someone else, or bits of it may work and other bits not.
That is very important for all of us to hear, because it is true. There's so many terms we have, you know, graceful aging, successful aging, productive aging, and what you're saying, and it's true. There's no right way, you know.
There isn't, and a lot of the successful aging messages are that you are aging successfully if you stay healthy, if you stay fit, if you eat kale, if you do sit-ups. And it's really important to take good care of ourselves as much as we are able, but it is also important to remember that if what you decide you want to do, especially, you know, there are loads of people who work tough jobs their whole lives who want to be able to relax. And that, you know, it is okay to sit in that porch swing. You know, we each age in our own way. And also to remember that many of the components of aging successfully cost money, right? You gotta be able to afford good food. You gotta be able to take time off your job to do yoga or have a vacation or, you know, eat kale and find sushi. And that it's important to remember that there is a strong socioeconomic bias in that model that disproportionately disadvantages people who do not have the resources to purchase these things and these supports that make them appear to be successful. I say if you are waking up in the morning, you are aging successfully.
I like that definition.
And we beat ourselves up. You know, we think, oh, I can't run as fast as I used to. Oh, my neck is wrinkly. I must be doing something wrong. Well, there's a good remedy against that. It takes some work, but it really works, which is consciousness raising, which means getting together with some people and comparing notes. And on my website, there is a free downloadable guide called Who Me, Ageist? A guide to starting a consciousness raising group, because that is the tool that catalyzed the women's movement. Women came together and compared notes about the ways in which they felt frustrated and dissatisfied, and realized that what they were talking about weren't personal problems. It wasn't that they had wrinkles or that their husbands didn't make enough money or their kids weren't blonde enough, that they were facing structural discrimination, right? A broad-based social problem that required collective activism, right? And that's what catalyzed the women's movement and has brought about such enormous changes in the status of women in my lifetime alone. I just turned 65. We're not there with aging. When we have trouble, when we get afraid or depressed, or we look in the mirror and think, what the hell happened? We think it's our fault, right? We internalize this message that to age is to fail, because that's what consumer society wants us to believe. And that's honestly what the medical establishment wants us to believe too, the pharmacological establishment, right? Because they make a lot of money selling us remedies, to mild cognitive impairment, which a lot of doctors don't even think is a condition. Or low T, when you get older as a man, your testosterone levels diminish. That's natural, right? Which isn't to say, again, there's a spectrum. There are some people for whom these are real medical problems who should see a doctor and get it treated. But again, if it's framed as a problem, we can be, then we feel like, oh, gee, I'm not doing it right. I'm not buying the right problems. I need to work on myself. And we do. We need the very first step, which is what consciousness raising does, is to look at your own attitudes, right? Oh my goodness, why do I speak this way or think this way about older people or about myself as an older person? And that's uncomfortable because you go, oh my goodness, I am really biased. I never questioned these stereotypes. But we haven't done it because these are new ideas. And the cool thing is, once you start it, and maybe you should speak to this story, I say it's like getting a genie out of a bottle. Once you start to see that it's not you, it is, you play a role in it, but that it's everywhere in the culture, it's like having a veil lifted. You see it everywhere, and you start to feel liberated and maybe even a little angry about these messages and where they come from. And it's very empowering to say, you know what, I'm going to try to think differently and to be liberated by this instead of being afraid or feeling diminished by it.
Because you mentioned in your book, and I think it's true too, that it's when you start talking with others, and I grew up in the generation of consciousness raising groups too for women, but you begin to realize how much is societal and how much gets internalized. And maybe you can speak a little more about that, because I know you've said that older people really are the most ageist of all, and I think that almost seems counterintuitive, but can you elaborate on that?
I mean, ageism is unusual in a number of ways. It's the only prejudice we will all face. It's the only sort of status. I mean, most of us are born one sex or another. We're born one race, so that's a fixed status through life. As we age, we start out disadvantaged from that point of view as children, because children don't have any power or voice. And then we sort of age into power, social capital, and then we age back out of it. Ageism is the last socially sanctioned prejudice. There are horrible greeting cards about saying, that start at age 30, not to mention 40. Like by the time you're 40, you're over the hill, you're pathetic, you're sad, you're supposed to be embarrassed about being 40. You're not even halfway through your life at 40. So, ageism casts a shadow across your whole life. It's not just a problem for older people. But when we are bombarded by these messages, or, children's books, there's a ton of ageism in children's books. Grandparents tend to be either, the placid, smiling granny, or else the crotchety Homer Simpson. And of course, those people exist, but most of us obviously are going to be somewhere in the middle. Kids get it from books and cartoons, and then you get, television advertising. Almost all the advertising of clothing and stuff is beautiful, flawless young people. Advertisements directed at older people are only for, you would think the only thing older people did was go on cruises and take medicine, right? So that, but if you have never thought to question them, just like earlier societies where people of a different color or women were just told, well, women can't run companies. You're too emotional. You don't know how to, you're too blah, blah, blah. Those were all stereotypes that were proven wrong. But we needed a movement to raise awareness so that people took that message out in the world. And internalized ageism is the idea that because, to put it brutally honestly, that to age is to lose value as a human being. And I think women face the double whammy of ageism and sexism because there's so much emphasis on how women look. And in this culture, there's not only the idea that to age is to lose value, but to age is to become unattractive. And I think women judge each other more harshly even than men do. I'm speaking, heteronormatively here. But if I ask my friends, do you really think you are less interesting, less powerful, less worth being with, less fun in bed? And I don't think we do think that, but we need to look more generously at each other and ourselves and carry that out into the world. And I think we have a lot to learn in this from the body acceptance movement and from the disability rights movement. If we really want a culture, I know this sounds very kumbaya, but it's also, I think, what we aspire to is a culture where people are not judged by what they look like, whether they are thin, whether they are blonde, whether they are in a wheelchair, whether they have wrinkles, right? If we want a society where what you look like doesn't govern access to opportunity, we need to add age to the list. And what's so fabulous is we do have a much more diverse society than we did 20 years ago. And my children's, I'm about to make an ageist statement about generations, but I think American society is growing more diverse. I think my friend cohort is more diverse than my parents was, et cetera, et cetera. It's more mixy-uppy. And it's pretty, when I say to people, what do you think of as criteria for diversity? No one has to be persuaded that diversity is a good thing. And they say, race, they say gender, they might say disability. When I say, what about age? No one says that's a dumb idea, right? They go, oh yeah. So I think we already have a lot of cultural momentum. I think 60 years ago when you said to someone, women could run a Fortune 500 company as competently as men, I bet a lot of people, and I include women, right? Because if you grow up in a society that says you're lesser, you're ugly, it's really hard not to believe it, right? But I think that was a much harder sell than to say to people in 2017, whoa, why shouldn't gray hair and wrinkles count as reasons that we shouldn't be discriminated against?
We have a long way to go. And language is so important.
Yeah, we tend to say, I feel young. And what we really mean when we say that is, or I hear even more, I don't feel old. I think a little bit of that is human. I think we in our heads, it's, we have a sense of who we were when we were at the time, maybe in our early 30s, when our sort of adult self sort of began to take pretty clear form. But what we really mean is I feel sexy, I feel active, I feel important. And we use young as a substitute for those good things. The fact is, you could feel those things at any age, just like when we say I don't feel old, we mean I don't feel ugly, I don't feel invisible, I don't feel useless. I don't know about you, Dorian, but when I was 13, I felt so ugly and so invisible and so depressed. And so the point being, not that you can't feel those things when you're old or young, but they're not age dependent. They're not a function of how old you are. They're a function of what's going on in your life at this time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that importance of feeling valued or feeling like there's some efficacy that you have, that you're going to impact things. And I think you're absolutely right that different ages, people don't feel very, I'm trying to think of, there's a lot of judgment. I guess that's what I'm saying.
A lot of judgment.
Yeah.
I've learned to be a lot less judgmental, right? And to think like next time you use the word old or young in a sentence, think about what are you using? Is it actually about whether something has been around for a long time or not? Because if it's not, think about whether there isn't a more accurate word, a better adjective to describe that feeling that is age independent.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the term ageless, which almost takes age out of it, which isn't such a good idea because there's really experience that comes with age. I like your term age fully. Maybe tell people more about that. Yeah.
I'm leery of inventing words. I'm not sure ageful is going to catch on. I hope people will start using my word for older people. I just say olders and younger.
Oh yeah, I wanted you to talk about that too. Yeah, right.
I'll talk about that a bit. But There's a scholar who said, why would we want to strip older people of their most valuable asset, their years, right? I mean, again, I am not a Pollyanna about aging. There's lots about it that is difficult and challenging, and I don't want to pretend that's not the case, but I want to make sure we hear both sides of the story. The narrative around aging is it's just lost. Your cartilage goes, your friends go, then you just all gets miserable as stuff gets stripped away from you. The fact is that age is obviously also, and maybe even more so, additive, right? We add experience, we add relationships, we add knowledge, and so the cover of the book is it looks a bit like those Russian nesting dolls, with a kid and then
right.
a bigger and bigger person. And I think about, maybe I'm on vacation at the beach, so I'm thinking of drip castles, but each year, each love affair, each loss adds to the totality of who we are. Right? So let's tell both sides of the story. And that I think of as being the discourse around ageless. Of course, you can have an ageless spirit, but what I take issue with, inside an aging body, but all too often ageless is used, especially it's all over the beauty industry, as an idea that you could strip away the traces of time and remain untouched. And that's a very seductive idea because we all want to believe we can keep doing the things we want to do, but we do it despite getting old and sometimes because of aging, because of the addition of years, not without them. We are a product of all those experiences. They are what make us us. So I say let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate being ageful instead of aspiring to be some stripped down, impoverished, frankly fake version of who we are because it conforms to consumer culture's ideals.
Mm-hmm. And it really does take into account really owning these different parts of ourselves and not wanting to become invisible to ourselves also.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that, we have to struggle to try and look and move like younger versions of ourselves it's really punishing. It's really punishing because it's impossible. Some of us, may do better along certain metrics, maybe, athletes or people who have cosmetic surgery. And again, no judgment, right? A lot of times I think, a point of that, I know an awful lot of people who say they're a couple years younger than who they are. I know zillions of people who dye their hair to cover the gray. And we do these things because they are really effective ways to avoid discrimination. I had a woman who came up to me after a talk and she said, if I didn't dye my hair, my boss would see how old I am. I would lose my job and I have children to support. And I do get that. But here's the thing is that dyeing our hair just to cover the gray if you hate doing it, or lying about your age because you're desperate to get a job or whatever, those are very successful strategies because we live in an ageist society. But they're like a person of color trying to pass for white, right? Or a queer person trying to pass for straight. They're based in shame about something that shouldn't be shameful. That's natural and powerful and part of who we are. So that's not good for us psychologically. And socially and politically, it gives a pass to the discrimination that makes those behaviors necessary. So I'm making a big ask. I have this slightly nutty idea, and I know we're not ready yet. But imagine if everyone who dyes their hair only to cover the gray, and only the people who don't like doing it. Suppose we could wave a magic wand, because I know it would take too long to grow it out, but have the day of letting our hair go gray. And if the world could see how many of us there are, and how beautiful we are, and how diverse we are, it would completely change in one day the idea that gray-haired people are this tiny, tottery, sad, decrepit fringe of society, right? So it'd be a really powerful way to challenge that notion. I know we're not ready yet. I got that. I put that idea and I got a ton of blowback, which I deserved. I said it in a sort of, we should do this thing. But I did dye my hair white. Someone said, I'd look crappy, you go first. So I dyed my hair white to see what it was. But, I'm
and
out
what
there.
Was it like for you?
I expect more company bit by bit, but I'm not saying that anyone should go dye their hair white tomorrow. But I think if you're able to look at your gray hair as a well-earned sign of all the things you've done and the places you've been, and try and battle that notion that it's ugly or that it means you're sexless or that it's something to be ashamed of. If you can get there, and it's hard, but it's true, it is beautiful. It is a part of who we are. It's a happier place if you can get to it, which, some of us will get part of the way, some of the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, we have a long way to go. I think I said that before, but I'm feeling it again. So how did you... Yeah. So the term older and younger, I like that. And maybe what's been the evolution of that for you from,
I'm a writer.
Again, language and terms.
Yeah. Language again. I mean, I'm very, very skeptical of new words because we have plenty of really good words. But when I was writing my book, every couple months someone writes a piece about why can't we figure out what to call older people. I decided the only acceptable word to me was older people. And I got tired of typing older people or older Americans. And I just shortened it to olders and youngers, which I like because no point in inventing a word unless people know what it means. But if you talk about olders and youngers, people know what it means. And I like it for two reasons. I like it because it's value neutral. I don't like seniors because it implies that younger people are junior or, lesser, and nobody likes seniors anyway. I don't feel comfortable with elder because it's not part of my culture, although it's a beautiful word. But again, I don't think I'm probably going to alienate some people with this comment, but I don't think people deserve respect just because they're old. I think they might deserve a seat on the bus if they look like they could use it, and a certain amount of deference in that narrow regard, more physical help with stuff if they would like that help. But everyone deserves respect, regardless of how old you are. And the idea so I like olders and youngers because it's neutral, and also because it emphasizes the really obvious idea that age is a spectrum. In an ageist culture, everyone is terrified of being old. No one wants that word. But most of us will readily cop to being older. Right? So it gets you a little over that hump. Ageism takes root in denial. Our refusal, our reluctance to acknowledge that we are not only going to get old, we're getting old right now every day. Every breath makes you a little bit older. If you can identify as older, you're partway to just letting loose on that, slipping that exhausting noose. Like, I'm older, it's happening. You can make it happen as fast or as slow as you're comfortable with. And so it busts up that old-young binary, which does not exist. The idea that at some point when you can't do X, when you can't, again, tyranny of still, when you can't, drive that sports car anymore, that suddenly you're dumped over into the old pool, the wrong side of the velvet rope where everything is awful, no one wants to be with you, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact is that there is no old-young divide. That divide segregates us, and it fills us with unnecessary dread. And if we can just think of ourselves as, older than some people, younger than others, it's much easier to see aging as the river that it is that carries us all along in a process we all share.
It does normalize it. It's nice hearing you say that and expand on it because, we are older than some and younger than others at whatever age we are.
Right. And if you think about it,
yeah.
Gender used to be a rigid binary, right? In most cultures, you were male or female. Look how far we've come in thinking of gender as a spectrum, right? Why it should be really, really easy to, by extension, acknowledge that age is obviously a gender, and again, we're back to fear. This fear that, I'll look old, I'll be old, I'll have to go to the old people's home and be with the old people, and it'll be awful. There is no divide, no absolute divide between old and young, partly because we all age at different rates, socially, neurologically, and physically, right? So you might have, the body of a marathoner, but you might have dementia. You might, odds are we're going to be in the messy middle where some things don't work that well. But, another thing nobody knows, 20% of people escape cognitive decline entirely. And think about it. We all know some of those really sharp 90-year-olds, right? And which isn't to say, I've always had a terrible memory. I can't remember the name of the movie I went to with what's her name, but that doesn't mean that I'm getting Alzheimer's, right? It is a natural part of brain aging. I say that's why God invented Post-its. The point is not that there's loss. Again, I'm not denying it, but I'm saying there's a zillion coping strategies that will allow me, if I'm lucky, which I think that I will be, not because of, for a reason I'll get into, I'll get better at putting I already am with my phone. It's like pisses me off so much when I can't find my phone. So I'm trying to be more systematic about putting the phone in one of 3 places. Now, maybe I wouldn't have had to do that when I was 17, but it doesn't mess me up, right? And sorry, I lost the track of what I was going to say on the way here, where I lost my phone memory.
About that it's different ages, and memory problems does not mean it's cognitive decline, and it can happen at any age.
Right, absolutely not. I mean, they say if you don't remember what keys are for, that's indicative of a severe problem. But back to the self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. If we anticipate, that's the thing with senior moment jokes. I used to make them. I thought they were funny. But every time we make a joke that equates cognitive decline with aging, we are saying something that we are implying that all older people become cognitively unfit, right? And we are also saying something that is deprecating about ourselves and that limits our sense of self, and especially when it comes to cognitive prowess. I say I don't tell senior moment jokes once it dawned on me that when I lost the car keys in high school, I didn't call it a junior moment. Right? Listen for whether you blame things on age that are not age related. Does your back hurt because you're 65 or because you spent the day, on your hands and knees playing with your grandchildren or cooking a meal for 50 people? Probably the younger people who helped you move your cousin yesterday, they're probably stiff too, right? It's a line in my TED Talk that I stole from Robert Butler. I said I stopped blaming my sore knee on being 65 because my other knee doesn't hurt and it's just as old.
I like that.
Right? Anytime a doctor says what to expect at your age, find a new doctor.
Yeah. Right. Let me start integrating. So I have so many questions I want to ask you too. I wish this could go on forever and ever, but let me start integrating some of the questions from our listeners. So Steve from York, Pennsylvania says, ironically, I've noticed that some long-term care facilities show significant signs of ageism. How can that best be identified and addressed?
That is a great question. It was surprising to me that older people could be as ageist or more than younger people because we've had more time to just make these stereotypes part of our way of thinking. We get stuck. And I was shocked to learn how many people in the aging industrial complex are ageist. And I think it's partly because many of them are dealing with people at the more debilitated end of the spectrum. And I think there's a ton of denial. Denial really is the enemy. I'm not going to end up like that. And you probably won't, but you might. So I think people in the industry may think like I've got this special sauce, it's never going to happen to me. I think the best thing you could do, Steve, is to promote consciousness raising. Use the guide. I was just in York, Pennsylvania, actually. I gave a talk at the university there. Use anything on my site. The book isn't free, but it's cheap on Amazon. Or I have a ton of videos and introduce people to these ideas. The cool thing is, Dorian keeps saying we have a long way to go, which is true. But it's also, I like to say, like washing a really dirty window. You can see where you've been. These are new ideas. And the cool part is when someone goes, whoa, someone said of my book, it's like all these things that are hidden in plain sight. And if you can get people to take that first step, which they have to be willing to do, right? Again, you have to be able to be willing to look at your own bias, and not everyone in those, facilities is going to be willing to. Some of them are going to say, I'm expert, I know everything I need to know. But you're going to find people who do take that first step, and it's so interesting and so liberating. You cannot get that genie back in the bottle. And I think you'll find lots, there are lots of tools out there on my website, and, see which ones are attractive to you. Watch a clip of one of my talks and talk about it. Do a reading group around the book or just a chapter of the book. There's a ton to talk about in every chapter, I promise.
There is. I can testify to that. It's, as I said earlier, in case some of you came on later, it's really a terrific book, and I recommend that people get it. One of you will get a copy today, but it's just filled with insight, and there's humor and resources. It's really excellent. All right, on to another question. So Mark from Oak Park wanted you to talk about tyranny of the still, and you already have. So Peggy from Arlington, Virginia says, what are the key things that older people can do in our culture to support a positive approach to aging? And some of these things you've spoken about. I just want to sort of ask some of these questions.
It's a big topic, so things overlap.
Right.
I think it's funny. I think that the things that older people can do are the fundamental act, which is not just true of older people, but is to look at our own attitudes towards age and aging by looking at your language, by looking at the media, by looking at advertising. Go to Yo, Is This Ageist is a question and answer blog where there's all sorts of examples of road signs, of advertising, of tweets, of whatever, of examples of ageism. And they're not all ageism. If you want a sense of what it looks like, to start to see it. And then take that change out into the culture, because if we're quiet about it, nothing changes. And to watch your own language. Are you using senior moment jokes? How do you use the words old and young? And when someone says something ageist to you, it's really hard to have a good snappy answer. I've only come up with one, which is when someone says, "You look great for your age." You say, "You look great for your age too." And it's uncomfortable, right? This stuff is uncomfortable because we are challenging bias. So you have to be ready to take a deep breath, but that's not a rude thing to say. That just says that puts on the table back at them what they've done to you, and they have to think, gee, why doesn't that feel like a compliment? And it's in that self-questioning that the change occurs. So if someone calls you young lady, it makes smoke come out of my ears, but I try not to show the smoke, and say, why would you call me young lady? Right? And so why would you say that? Why would you think that? I have a much older friend who had been away, and she came to a social gathering, and some guy said to her, "I can't believe you're still up and around." Now, what the heck is she supposed to say to that? Except, now, why would you say that? And the truth is, the only reason he's saying that is that she's really old. And it's not okay. Mm-hmm. So think about, the next step would be, educate yourself, look at your own bias, squirm a little bit, and then take that awareness out into the world. The last chapter of the book, I'm sorry to sound like a shill for the book, or ask your library to carry it. To stock it, and look at the last chapter. It's called Occupy Age, and it's full of all sorts of practical suggestions for ways to look at your language, at your behavior, at society around us, to say, would we say a similar thing based on race or based on sex? If the answer is heck no, then it's probably not okay to say on the basis of age either.
Which is why I'm pretty sure that part of your book title is a manifesto against ageism, because you are challenging the bias and providing some guidelines on how to, the consciousness raising groups and some of these notions about what would our world look like, what would our society look like beyond ageism. And it's really interesting to have it in your face to see that, because we all are products of what we say and how we say it.
Movement takes millions of people. So it's not about me at all. It is about each one of us who cares enough, and, not everyone does, but those of us who feel like it is not right to be judged on the basis of age, to take that change out into the world in whatever way and whatever scale makes sense to you. You're not going to agree with everything I say, or you're going to say, gee, I could never do that, but I could do this. We need thousands of leaders and millions of people to make this our struggle in whatever way feels right to us.
Great. Well, let me just keep on because there's more questions here. Oh, go ahead.
Which is fantastic.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The fact that, you guys are listening to the show and called in to ask these questions shows me that you are already part of this movement. So I would say thank you, except that implies that you're doing me a favor. We're all doing all of us and society a favor, and that we have to, each of us, carry it forward in our own way.
Said. So let me keep on with some of these questions here. Well, one is a comment. Carla from Indy says, respectfully, I disagree that there's no such thing as age appropriate. And for example, she says, I no longer wear short skirts.
I think that we should wear whatever clothes we feel comfortable in. And I think it's not even a question of whether you have great legs or bad legs. I'd like to make an analogy here to the body awareness, body acceptance movement. Mm-hmm. There's a ton of messages that say you shouldn't wear a two-piece or short shorts unless you are young and thin. If you don't feel comfortable wearing those things, you shouldn't wear them at any age, for whatever reason. But I think there's an enormous message in this society that says unless you are, young and thin, you should not do X. You should not dance. You should not go to that part of town where the hip kids are. You should not go to that club. That does a number of things. It makes our world smaller, and it hurts our self-esteem because we believe these things. So I'm not saying go put on a miniskirt to you, but I urge others who have worn miniskirts it is perfectly appropriate if you feel comfortable, not to do things that will make us look young, in quotes, because you can only look the age you are, but not to stay home or not wear that thing because you think it is only for younger people, because it is only by challenging these stereotypes that we shake up the idea that, XYZ is just for young people and LMNOP is just for old people. There are activities that fewer and fewer older people do, like staying up late and going dancing, but that doesn't mean that older people should stay home because it's not age appropriate. It may not be you appropriate, which is totally fine. But again, age should not be the reason. I mean, we sometimes do go out late to a club, and my partner and I, we're always the oldest people there. We wish we weren't. We wish we weren't the oldest, but we don't want to stay home just because we'll stick out. And I think, I know most of the people there don't even notice us. Maybe a few people roll their eyes, but I know that a few others are going, whoa, when I'm as ancient as they are, maybe I can do this, keep doing this because I really like it. And that's how we integrate society and change ideas. I know, I wish I could say if you're, 80 years old and out in a miniskirt, people aren't going to roll their eyes. But around the fashion world, there's a ton of really interesting stuff. There are older models. There's this Fashionistas, Fabulous Fashionistas is a movie. There's the Advanced Style blog of older women who are super stylish, we're talking. Their lives are style, but I see tons of comments from younger women saying, that's how I want to be when I get old. I'm not judging you. I'm not saying that you're frumpy just because you don't want to wear miniskirts. So I'm not implying for a minute that you're not super stylish, but where these older women are challenging the idea of age, especially for women, as sort of giving up and retreating and becoming invisible. So if you don't want to do that, stick with how you want to be in the world and what feels comfortable to you, rather than what you think a person of your age should or should not be doing or wearing.
I think that's the liberating part that you're talking about, that, it's like a personal awareness and personal choice, yeah.
And for some older women, it means not giving a damn anymore. It's like, I'm not going to worry about strapping myself into some skinny dress and wearing shoes that hurt. Men aren't staring at me anymore. Fine. It's really nice to go out not worrying about that. That is a perfectly legitimate way to do it. Other women do surgery and whatever. They're determined to wear high heels to the end. More power to them, right? We each do it in our own way.
There's a comment here. The person doesn't say who they are, but just says, my mom used to say she'd never dye her hair gray because she earned every single one of them. However, I prefer to keep myself brunette. She says, fortunately, I don't have enough gray yet to make that decision. So just another comment from somebody.
Perfect story.
Right. So Michelle from Canada says, can you speak about ageism in employment? I, as well as many of my friends, have been let go around 55 years. Nobody wants to hire us, and we all expected to work for another 10 years or so. There are no encore careers in our future. How do we create a movement in the workplace?
It's such an important issue, and I wrote a New York Times op-ed about it that might be useful to you, called "You're How Old? Well, we'll get back to you." Ageism in the workplace is just a subset of ageism everywhere. There is a chapter in the book about the workplace in which I show that every single myth, a stereotype about older workers is absolutely not true, that mixed-age workforces are the best. My answer, I'm afraid, is take that data into people, but you have to get people to be willing to listen to you in the first place. And I'm sure you've tried. I know so many terrible, terrible stories. And, you already know that it's important, not to wear bell bottoms and to learn how to, open a computer. And there's 10,000 websites out there on how to, how to hone your workplace skills. My answer is, and it is a really huge and ambitious one, but that we need to work, all of us, to change the culture at the fundamental level, the way the women's movement changed the way we look at women and made it possible for women to enter the workforce at all sorts of higher levels and in different ways. Not that we don't have a long way to go on that front, so that older people, so the same process becomes true of older workers. We need a broad-based social movement like the women's movement, and it's big, but I think, as I mentioned, I think we have a shorter route to go, partly because of the demographics of the baby boom, but a lot of millennials are on board too. It's got to involve people of all ages. It's got to be cross-generational, because the things that hurt older workers in the workplace aren't good for younger workers either. Millennials face a ton of grief for being entitled, being told they're entitled, being told they need their hands held, blah, blah, blah. That's ageism too. That makes it hard for younger workers. So, to challenge the bias that underlies discrimination in the workplace and everywhere else.
So Don from Canada, his question ties right into what you were just saying in terms of millennials and the age discrimination there. He says, studies suggest that millennials are just as narcissistic as they are reputed to be. How do we deal with this self-centered cohort, which is likely to be at best indifferent to ageism and soon enough in charge of the world?
The idea that a generation is any one way is, of course, as ageist as it can be. The counterpoint to that is baby boomers. I'm like mid-baby boom, so I'll say we. I was born in 1952. We had the incredible good fortune to come of age in a period of undisturbed economic prosperity. So the counter-narrative is, oh, you baby boomers took it all for yourself. You left us a messed up planet and no money. Thanks so much. Now we have student debt. Now we have XYZ. The fact is that it is incredibly unhelpful to look at it in terms of old versus young. Back to what I was saying before about how prejudice pits us against each other. As long as you and I, as boomers, are arguing with millennials about who's more selfish, we're never going to build a more egalitarian workforce that mobilizes against what I see as a much bigger challenge to all of us, which is, automation, for example, or increasing the minimum wage. Those are issues that affect all workers. So, I know plenty of selfish millennials. I know plenty of incredibly fantastic, selfless, purposeful, and there's tons of research that shows that millennials are much more involved in social justice stuff, in environmental causes. That's not selfish. You don't make money and you're working to make the world a better place. So rather than arguing about, the percentage of millennials who are X versus Y, I urge you to try and think of it as, how can we work to make it better for both instead of one at the expense of the other. I mean, a very common myth you hear in the workplace is that all those old people are taking jobs away from that younger workers need. That's a myth. It's called the fallacy of the lump of labor. You can look it up. This is an example of how to reframe old people are bad story. If there's only 10 jobs or the only job in town is a barista at Starbucks, you're going to have older and younger people competing for it. But that's not, in general, older and younger people don't compete for the same jobs. And that's not a too many old people problem. It's a labor market problem, right? Same with a whole discourse around age-friendly cities. Why should we spend money on like benches for old people and ramps for, handicapped people? Everyone likes a bench. Ramps are great for strollers and for delivery guys, right? So these changes that make the workforce that we're all going to need more flexible work, right? We all want more time to look after the people we care for. And those are changes that benefit the younger and olders at both ends of the spectrum. Really important that we come together and collaborate on changes that work for both ends, or they're not going to be sustainable, and we're going to waste a ton of energy arguing about who's more selfish, instead of like the stay-at-home moms versus the moms who work outside the home, instead of getting together to figure out how we're going to make a more egalitarian society for everybody.
And again, it just ties into that ageism of, kind of cuts across all age categories there.
Yeah.
And that we can be ageist without realizing it. I mean, all of us. So
Yeah.
Some more questions. Are you still up for some more questions?
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yep.
Okay. Isabel from Bethesda says, how do you define those folks who get benefits after a certain age, i.e. movie and other discount services from government and nonprofit, seats on the bus, train? Now the term typically used is seniors or older adults. How can olders and youngers be applied for these situations?
Oh, that's a great question. So someone, wrote into, is this ageist? Are senior discounts ageist? Of course they are. Ideally, everyone would carry around their tax returns, and you would give a discount to the people who actually need, who can't afford the full price, whatever it is, which is why you often see student discounts, of course, because students don't have money. The fact is that, we live in a giant bureaucracy. We need systems. We need simplification. So the idea is, of course, that many older people are retired on fixed incomes and have less money. Age is funny because of the wealthy 1%, a disproportionately high percentage of it, I think 10%, I'm not sure, are older people, because we tend to amass wealth as we tend to be wealthier as we are older than we were when we were very young. But that does not mean that all that all older people are rich. So, I would have a magic wand that, just like you would have time to have an individual conversation with every human being to find out what they're capable, rather than assuming that because they're white-haired, they may not be the best person to ask you to help you carry your suitcase up the steps or whatever. Life, that's not efficient. The human brain, every time we turn our head, our brain is saying, is that dangerous? Is it moving? Is it a tiger? Is it a tree? Is it whatever? Is it familiar? Is it alien? We need shortcuts in order to operate as human beings and as societies. So senior discounts are one of them. Mandatory retirement ages are some of them. And certain professions have them, like airline pilots. Ideally, every pilot, every driver, every surgeon could be tested every year to find out whether you deserve that senior discount at the movies and whether you should still be cutting into people with a scalpel or flying an airplane. That's inefficient. And as a shortcut, especially when it comes to public safety, there are age limits, and they are ages, but they are necessary for the efficient functioning of society. Senior discounts make lots of older people really happy. Ideally, wealthy older people would not take as much Social Security. They would say, I'll put that back in for people who can use it more. But in order for that to happen, we need to have a broader and more generous view of the social contract that we're all party to.
So Claire from New York says, we need an Ashton app to be able to remember all of the wonderful and witty points that you have made, like an arsenal for us to help share our points with others. I recommend that people get her book. It really is a wonderful book that has her witty comments and observations about ageism.
And I have a This Chair Rocks Facebook page for any of you on Facebook that I post almost every day, ageism-related stuff. Also, I'm on Twitter at This Chair Rocks. So ton of stuff up there. Sign up for my mailing list at the bottom of my homepage. I only send out an email about every 3 months, no spam.
Say your website.
My website is thischairrocks.com, And you can see there's a blog where I've been writing about this thinking out loud on my blog for 10 years. So it's searchable by topic. You can find a ton of my research there. There's a resources link where you can find the consciousness raising guide and books that I recommend, articles, blah, blah, blah. ThisChairRocks.com, This Chair Rocks Facebook page, and at This Chair Rocks on Twitter.
So Meg from Boston says, this is a wonderful conversation presentation. I missed a bit at the beginning about productiveness, but would like to pursue this a little since it's been difficult for me to come to terms with what I consider a loss in competence and productivity as I age. I think this is more than ageism, but a cultural problem of our increasingly frantic, productivity-driven society. One of the potential gifts of aging, I believe, is the desire and possibility to take more time to savor life, to be more present.
Wow, that is beautifully put. Two things. I think it is painful when we can't run as fast as we used to or are become less competent at something that matters to us. And, aging does involve loss. And clearly there are those real things. So the whatever loss you're feeling, I'm sure it's real. And I don't think it's ageist of you to say, to mourn it. I think one thing to focus on is what do we mean by productive? In this society, we tend to think of productivity as being something that pays money, hopefully a lot of it. And just as Dr. Butler said to me, if you can get yourself up out of bed in the morning and maybe get dressed, you are being productive because someone else doesn't have to do it for you, right? And even if someone does have to help you with it, then you're helping give that person a job. So that's productive. So to broaden our vision, if you are a Neanderthal grandmother and all you're doing because you can't go stab mammoths anymore is keep the babies out of the campfire, that's productive, right? So if you go look in on maybe you're 80 and your neighbor is 90, maybe you're 80 and your neighbor is 30, but she broke her foot, right? To look in on our neighbors and make sure we're okay, that is being productive, that is contributing to social well-being. To your second eloquently put point about being present, there's really interesting research that shows that the neurological basis of that U-curve of happiness, that shows that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives, is based in awareness that time is short. Another totally ageist thing I assumed at the beginning was, A, must suck to get old, and B, must suck to get old in large part because death is getting closer and closer, and that fear must be terrible. It turns out that the longer people live, the less they fear dying. And part of that, it's those cognitive changes that happen around 80, but it is also, and it's not a paradox, it is simply a function of aging itself for almost all of us, that the awareness that time is short makes us more able to savor the present. We choose what we want to do with our time more wisely. We may choose to spend it with a narrower group of people. Laura Carstensen, who founded the Stanford Longevity Center, it's her research, and she has the example of cocktail parties. She says young people will go to cocktail parties because they might meet someone who'll come in handy someday, even though nobody really likes cocktail parties. And older people are more likely to say, you know what, I don't need to stand around and maybe meet someone who'll come in handy. I'm going to spend that time with people I already know are super precious to me because I may not have that much more time with them. And that is what makes us happy, being in the moment.
And I think that understanding and appreciating of our mortality at whatever age we really realize it does help us not take things for granted. And absolutely, as you say, as we get older,
it doesn't make us more fearful. I mean, that's what I assume. But if, right. I don't know if you read, Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, he spoke at TED also, so it was really a geeky thrill to meet him. And I said, I think of my work of being a precursor to your work, because if we don't acknowledge that we're going to die someday, it can be as far off as you need it to be, but just acknowledge that you're not going to be like the only person ever in the world to survive forever. It's a relief, right? You're no longer like you're spending all this energy nurturing what you know is a fallacy. We are going to get old and we are going to die. And so there are studies that show that the more you know about aging, the less terror it has, because most of our fears are based in misconceptions, right? So I have a thing in my book about becoming an old person in training, right? Just acknowledge someday you're going to get old. It can be a million miles down the horizon. but it means that you get off this hamster wheel of age denials. Never going to happen to me, right? And when you meet older people, you look at them in the eye, right? You talk to them. And you see behaviors that they are engaging in that you like, and others you're like, I don't want to do that. I don't like that so much. Or look how she did that. And you just start preparing for it, just like thinking about dying. None of us, I'm still afraid of dying for sure. But I understand that knowing that it's going to happen and starting a conversation with my kids about what I think I'm going to want at the end if I need help makes it much less. My kids were dreading this conversation. And it was like, oh, God, Mom's going to have the talk. And my daughter came 2 days later. She and her girlfriend were there. And she said, Emily said, I really wasn't looking forward to that. And I felt so much better. It's like a kid. If you look at the bed, there is a monster under the bed. We're going to get old. Some part of our bodies are going to fail. We're going to lose friends we've known our whole life. That's just true. But there's also benefits. And B, looking under the bed is never as scary as what you thought was under the bed. So just looking, right, and acknowledging it is a huge and liberating thing.
It certainly is. Huge and liberating. All right, 2 more and then I'm going to cut it off. One, Kit from Boston says, we need a social movement, but I also think we need some new laws that can balance things out. For instance, a law that cracks down on companies that toss people out at a certain age. At present, the decks are stacked strongly against older workers and especially long-term unemployed older workers. The latter up against resume tracking systems that ensure that olders are weeded out without any eyes viewing their resumes.
Couldn't agree more. One thing that I learned from writing my previous book is that laws don't change behavior. Behaviors change laws, right? First, society has to change. My book was about women in divorce, and people assumed that more women got divorced after no-fault divorce came in. The no-fault laws followed broader social trends in divorce. So we've got to change the culture in order for those laws to change. Secondly, the kind of age discrimination you describe is illegal. It's the ADEA, American Discrimination in Employment Laws. Did I have it right? No. ADEA. It is illegal to discriminate against anyone on the basis of age in the workforce after age 40. It is illegal to advertise for digital immigrants. All this stuff is already illegal. What there is not is the public outrage around this. There's also, I just met with the people at AARP who are doing a ton of good stuff about this. Age discrimination is hard to prove, and they are working at changing a bill in Congress that makes the burden of proof higher in ageism cases than proving discrimination on the basis of race or sex. A lot of people don't bring age discrimination cases because they are afraid it will make them, wait for it, look old. They don't want to acknowledge that they are old enough to have been the subject of a suit. We've got to work on that shame and stigma, personal and public, in order to change the landscape around discrimination. It's awful. It's unfair. It destroys lives. And I am totally with you that this is an urgent social problem.
And it's actually an urgent social problem about elder abuse also. Just coming back to that shame and all that you're talking about. That
social and economic problem, I should say. Yeah, it's wrong.
Yeah, right. So the final question, Kathy from Canada says, how do you deal with the skepticism that accompanies boomers' efforts to combat ageism, i.e. that we are only talking about this because we're old and this is just a continuation of our self-centered outlook on the world?
See, now that there is, and we already had a comment about millennials being self-centered. I think that's a function of both groups being so large demographically. The fact is the world does have to pay attention to what we're thinking and saying because there are so many of us, and by that alone we have purchasing power and voting power. I think it depends on who you're talking to and what the context is. I would try the diversity argument about, do you want, if you want a world and a workplace in which access to opportunity doesn't depend on what you look like, why wouldn't age be a category just in terms of fundamental fairness and social justice? And also the enlightened self-interest argument, right? Someday you will be old, so the changes we make will benefit you. And also pointing out that a lot of the changes that older workers want, like flex time and handicap accessibility, benefit younger workers, benefit anyone with young kids, benefit students, benefit anyone trying to juggle work and life, which is pretty much everyone now, as the gig economy makes the workforce less secure for everybody, right? So let's think of what workplace protections, think of legitimate arguments you might make that show how they benefit workers of all ages, not to mention those millennials who may be griping about them, but who will benefit from them down the line. And also, if we boomers can stay on the job longer and face less discrimination, we are less likely to require, it's so obvious, right? Families are multi-generational. It's dumb to grouse about olders getting Social Security because that means that younger workers don't have to support them, just like it drives me nuts when older people complain about paying school taxes. It's like, don't you want an educated citizenry? I say, don't you want the person delivering your oxygen tank to be able to read the instructions? Right? So zoom up and think what's good for society as a whole.
Well, I think that's a big part of this manifesto that you have of just, of people really thinking about ourselves, being aware of ourselves, but also thinking about what's good for the world of all ages. Yeah. You have sections in your book about age-friendly cities and a section about, beyond ageism. And, we didn't have time to talk about sort of the ageism in terms of attitudes about our body and about sexuality. So I really do recommend people buy the book. This has just been wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And a number of people have just said, this has just been wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. What final takeaway would you like people to have as they leave today?
I would say the idea that all social change starts inside each of us, right? It has to start with looking at what you might want to have be different in the world means operating differently in the world. So look at your own attitude toward your own age and aging and think about where some of those ideas come from and what purpose they serve. And then, so that's the first and essential step. So think about taking that in whatever way or scale. If you don't want to buy the book, just noodle around my website or look at Yo, Is This Ageist? And think about some of your ideas and which ones we're just stuck with out of habit and what it would look like if we could shake free of them individually. And then the next step is, how would the world be different if we all took that new awareness out into it?
In the book, as I said before, I really do recommend it. And toward the end of the book, I actually have it right in front of me, page 239. Ashton lists some places to start with some really great ideas. It starts with the self-awareness, but really good ideas of thinking about and interacting just more consciously and intentionally, and I think less judgmentally in our interactions, because it really does have to start with us. I think you're so right on that. Thank you so much, and for taking this extra time. I think there were some wonderful questions and comments, and I know it's your vacation, so go back to the beach. And thank you very much, and congratulations. Ashton had said that now that she's 65 and has Medicare, she's going to be leaving her job and being able to do her activism about ageism full-time now, or as full-time as she wants it to be. And there were a couple of people on the call who wanted to be in touch with you about your availability for speaking. Should they go through, should I share your email or should they just go through your website?
I have a speakers bureau. I will forward their request and thanks in advance. Ashton at thischairrocks.com.
Thank you again so much, and thank you everybody for being part of the call. Happy summer. Take care.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks again.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.